Hey guys, it's your retired teacher back again, and this time I'm starting up with the second part of LBJ. We're going to be looking at things happening in the country during his presidency. We're going to be exploring the Warren Court right now and how SCOTUS, well, the Supreme Court of the United States, alters the landscape of criminal justice and civil rights. And then we're going to go ahead and look at things happening on the home front during Vietnam. So the counterculture, hippies and stuff, protests. And we're going to go ahead and look at other rights movements along with, well, the Vietnam War and LBJ's role in the Cold War and his foreign policy. So we got an action-packed filled day today. There's a lot of stuff going on in the 60s. So let's go ahead and wrap up the 60s with today's stuff. So, all right, first up, we got the Warren Court. So the Warren Court is arguably one of the most activist courts that we've seen with the Supreme Court. So we usually name court phases or whatnot after the Chief Justice, and so the Chief Justice here is Earl Warren. So he's going to do so much to expand the rights of the accused. He looks at civil liberties, and I mean, this guy is a very, very activist judge. I mean, he even gets to the point where people are like, impeach Warren. He's a conservative. He was appointed by Eisenhower, and this dude is acting anything but conservative. He's activist, so that means that he is actively changing the status quo. He is redefining a lot of these rights that these cases are going to refer to. So there's a lot of important cases with the Warren Court, so let's go ahead and break these down. So during his Supreme Court, tenure, we're going to look at cases that abolish school prayer, that address the issue of congressional apportionment, establish the exclusionary rule, which is, that's really, really important to the criminal justice system because it forbids courts to use illegally obtained evidence at trial. So again, expanding the rights of the accused. Guaranteed the right of counsel in felony cases. So that's another big one. Guaranteed that defendants, that they could have counsel present at police interrogations. So that's another big one. And required police to read the suspects their constitutional rights at the time of arrest. So a lot of this is going to seem very familiar to you guys. Because seriously, a lot of this we kind of take for granted now. But back in the 60s, these rights were not necessarily guaranteed until the Supreme Court cases happened. So, other stuff that Earl Warren's court is going to look at, First Amendment rights that will protect the actions of protesters, grant greater freedom of the press, ban religious activity sponsored by public schools, so separation of church and state right there, and guaranteed the adults a right to contraceptives. So that expands on our rights to privacy. So, first big case is Mapp versus Ohio. So, this is a very important case for the criminal justice system because this establishes the exclusionary rule. So what was going on is this lady right here, Delbury Mapp, the police in Cleveland were looking for a fugitive. And they didn't have a warrant. They came back with a piece of paper, waved it in front of her face, and was like, here, look, warrant. Then they searched her house. They didn't find the fugitive, but what they found was obscene materials that were considered illegal in the state of Ohio. So she instead is charged with obscenity. Now, the Supreme Court is going to overturn this conviction because they're like, hey, the evidence that you obtained was illegal. It wasn't specifically listed on the search warrant. So therefore, it should have been excluded in trial. So this right here establishes the exclusionary rule. So a further example of that is let's say that the cops show up at your house. They're looking for a stash of weapons, and they find drugs instead. And they charge you for the drugs. That's pretty much what happened roundabout way with MAP right here. So the exclusionary rule would kind of go against that because the drugs per se weren't like listed on the search warrant. You see what I mean? They'll have to go back, get another search warrant, and make sure that it's specifically listed for it to be used in trial. So that's MAP versus Ohio. Big case number 1. Big case number 2 that expands the rights of the accused is Gideon versus Wainwright. So Gideon right here, Clarence Earl Gideon, is convicted of armed robbery in Florida and sentenced to 5 years. So he's going to ask the court to appoint an attorney for him because he can't afford one. And he's like, hey, I've got the right to counsel. I should have one appointed to me. The judge says no, because the Supreme Court, there was this precedent with the Supreme Court that didn't allow poor defendants a public defender, which a public defender is a court-appointed attorney, right? So Gideon, from jail, writes a petition to the Supreme Court saying that his Sixth Amendment right to counsel was violated. So that's a copy of his handwritten petition to the court. And the Supreme Court's like, you know what? Yeah, let's take up the case. So Gideon gets a new trial out of this with a lawyer this time, and this time he's acquitted this time around. So, I mean, bruh, this is right to counsel, if you can't afford one. So, yeah, important case. So, another important case are these two right here, Escobar versus Illinois and Miranda versus Arizona. So, these two cases kind of go hand in hand, and that's how the Supreme Court, really addresses them. So, in Escobar versus Illinois, police need to inform the arrest person of their right to remain silent. Because remember, you've got the Fifth Amendment with self-incrimination and all that. So that's what they're kind of going with. And therefore, the police need to remind you, you've got the right to remain silent. You don't have to talk to the police. And then with Miranda versus Arizona, this one definitely expands on all of those rights of the accused. So Ernesto Miranda right here was arrested for kidnapping and rape. He signs a confession without seeking legal counsel or being read his rights. Because, seriously, if you weren't learning this stuff in school, would you really know what your rights are? If we never taught you guys the Bill of Rights, would you know that you have First Amendment rights, right to counsel, rights of the accused, any of the Bill of Rights? You probably wouldn't. So, this is why it's so important for people to be informed of their rights. And that's why the Supreme Court with Miranda versus Arizona agrees. They agree that Miranda's Fifth Amendment rights were violated because the police didn't even inform him that he had the right to counsel or, self-protection, that he didn't have to answer the questions without counsel present. So the conviction is overturned. So what Miranda versus Arizona does is extend what Escobar versus Illinois had already set up, to have the right to a lawyer being present during your police questioning. So Miranda ends up being convicted again because he does another crime later. And, they used other evidence to get him this time, so in his second trial. But anyways, this is where we get our Miranda rights. You guys have heard these. You have the right to remain silent. Okay, we see that in Escobar versus Illinois. Anything you say can and will be used against you at trial. Again, Escobar versus Illinois and Miranda versus Arizona. You have the right to legal counsel. So there's Gideon versus Wainwright and Escobar versus Illinois and Miranda versus Arizona. If you cannot afford counsel, it will be provided to you at no charge. So there's Gideon versus Wainwright. There we go. We now have our rights established. Police officers need to inform you of these rights at the time of arrest. So if they don't, then your arrest can be overturned. And that just pretty much throws out the case. So when it comes to First Amendment rights and like freedom of the speech, press, and, separation of church and state and all that, a very important case that deals with this is Tinker versus Des Moines. So this actually applies to high school students. Yeah, believe it or not, the Supreme Court was like hooking you guys up with rights. So here's what happens in the Tinker case. So students and parents are going to organize a protest of the Vietnam War. And what they do is pretty interesting. They do a symbolic protest. So basically the students wear black armbands to school in symbolic protest of the Vietnam War. But when the school finds out, they're going to warn these students and parents that anybody wearing the armbands would be suspended. Okay? The Tinker children wore their armbands to school anyways. And they were suspended. So, Mr. and Mrs. Tinker are going to file a suit claiming that the school violated the kids' rights to freedom of speech and expression, guaranteed by the First Amendment. The school is like, nope, armbands are disruptive to the learning environment. So the Supreme Court sides with the students and parents. The Supreme Court says that students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gates. So what the court basically established was symbolic speech in this case. Now, don't get me wrong. It also established that school districts have a right to have a dress code policy. So that's where they get you now, okay? If they put it in the school board policy that you can't wear anything that's deemed disruptive to the learning environment, and they, go into that, yeah, you can't necessarily pull a Tinker too much. But there's going to be several other cases with the Burger Court after the Warren Court that will deal with the rights of students and scale back some of them. But anyways, Tinker, yeah, that's all about you guys. Okay, another case that expands Fourth Amendment rights and the rights to privacy over one's body is Griswold versus Connecticut. So this establishes the right to privacy through the Fourth Amendment and the Ninth Amendment. All right, so here's what happens. In Griswold versus Connecticut, this has to deal with contraceptives. So I think what had happened was that they were passing out pamphlets about contraceptives, and the state kind of got mad about it. Somebody correct me in the comments. I know it was about contraceptives and, passing out literature or making them accessible to people or something. And the state of Connecticut had that as illegal. So this rules that Connecticut couldn't prohibit the use of contraceptives by adults. And really, the greater importance of this case is that later on in the 70s, when Roe versus Wade comes around and we're arguing about abortion, this is one of those cases that is used as a precedent for Roe versus Wade. So that means that they're using this case to establish the groundwork on how to decide Roe versus Wade. So by using the Fourth Amendment, they're using this clause of the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. And then with the Ninth Amendment, they're saying that certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So remember, that's the whole powers reserved to the people clause right there in the Ninth Amendment. And of course, Fourth Amendment, right to privacy. So those are the really important cases for the Warren Court. There's more that deal with First Amendment rights, like with school prayer, also having religious symbolic stuff in government buildings. So, yeah, those are other important cases that the Warren Court looks at. But we will move on because I wanted to only highlight the super, super, super important ones for you guys. Because, yeah, we're running out of time. April. So let's go ahead and talk about culture and society this time. And this is where we're going to get into the other rights movements besides the civil rights movement. So we're talking women's movement. We're talking the free speech movement. We're talking the counterculture. We're talking the student movement. We're talking also the Chicano movement. And Native Americans are fighting for their rights as well. So we got movements, all right? So first up, let's go ahead and set up the student movement and the new left, which will be the counterculture. Well, it'll lead to the counterculture. Okay, so going back a little bit with historical context. Remember, baby boom, lots of kids. Kids from the baby boom are now teenagers, a vast majority of them. So in the 60s, what we're going to start to see is major social changes, because we're not really seeing society being completely dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males anymore. Minority groups are going to start to be on the rise and start to claim a larger part of American society. So they look at themselves, they look at their rights, and they're like, yeah, this is a bunch of crap. We need to fight for our rights. And then this sort of activism is prevalent amongst the youth. So, because remember, baby boomers, we got a lot of them at that time. And they're, high school age, college age by this time. So, the number of 18 to 24-year-olds enrolled in college degree programs, drastic rise, right, in the 60s and 70s, because baby boomers are coming of age. The vast majority of them are. So, with this high concentration of young kids in college and high school, they're going to start to look at their rights amongst universities and whatever colleges they're attending, and they're going to come up with a list of demands. Basically it's a natural progression. They want more rights on college campuses. So this is where groups like SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, are going to start popping up. So SDS is formed at Port Huron, Michigan. And what's going on here is they draft up a declaration of purposes. It's known as a Port Huron Statement. And what they essentially want the university to do is that they want university decisions to be made through, participatory democracy, so that students have a voice in the decisions affecting their lives, their education, all of that. So they want more like activism. They want kind of like a student government kind of thing going on. So activists and intellectuals are going to support this. And what we're going to label the student rights movement and the people involved will be the new left. Now, the new left is going to push for free speech at college campuses. So this is where the free speech movement begins. The University of California at Berkeley is like the hot spot for this, for sure. The students at Berkeley are going to demand that the university end restrictions on student political activities. Across college campuses throughout the mid-60s, they're going to be protesting university rules that go against, the right to drink, dorm visits by members of the opposite sex. I mean, there is some strict rules going on campus, so they're kind of fighting against those. They also want a greater voice in the government of the university. So they want student regents, they want student government for sure, to have a greater say-so in what happens. So these demonstrations are also going to coincide with, the escalation of the Vietnam War. So we're going to start to see the free speech movement start up with wanting free speech and a change of rules on college campuses. And as we get to the late 60s, they're going to shift gears and go towards protesting the Vietnam War. So there's going to be anti-war protests springing up around the country on college campuses. SDS, the violent fringes of it, like the Weathermen, are going to attack, they're going to embrace violence and vandalism and try to attack American institutions. So we do have a tinge of radicalism there. And this kind of discredits the early involvement of the New Left and the early idealism that they were trying to exhibit. So yeah, kind of like how the civil rights movement was starting to turn a little bit more violent with the introduction of Black Power and the Black Panthers, and that kind of discredited a little bit of the civil rights movement. So the Weathermen kind of discredit the New Left in a similar fashion. So now let's jump to the counterculture. All right. So we start to see hints of the counterculture in the 50s. Remember how we're talking about like how 50s was like, oh, suburbia, perfect family, everything looks spotless, everything is freaking perfect. Like a 50s sitcom. Okay? We needed to act a certain way. We needed to conform because we didn't want to be labeled a communist, right? So we're going to reinforce gender roles at this time, consumerism, and, well, conservative values. So we see groups in society in the 50s try to fight against this with the beatniks, right? They were the ones trying to fight against the conformity and the consumerism of the 50s with their coffee shops and slam poetry. But anyways, how I was saying with the 50s lecture, how they're kind of like the precursor to the hippies. They really are. Because the counterculture is really influenced by like the beatniks' poetry and books and whatnot. So the counterculture of the 60s is pretty much going to embrace this whole like peace, love kind of stuff. And really the political protests of the New Left are going to go hand in hand with the counterculture. The counterculture is going to express themselves with how they dress, their music, their drug use, communal living. So really, hippies and flower children are going to be just counterculture, all right? And this is what we see. So long hair, beards, beads, jeans. You guys know what hippies look like. So how music influences them. It's a lot of folk music. We have people like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan who are going to create protest songs, essentially. Rock and roll is very popular at this time, too, amongst the counterculture. So the Beatles even get into this. Rolling Stones, Jim Morrison with The Doors, Janis Joplin. I mean, they're all going to sing about this. And this all culminates in the Woodstock Festival in upstate New York that happens in 1969. So it's kind of like the cornerstone of the counterculture. Another big thing that really identifies the counterculture is drug usage and free love. So, we mean people sleeping with each other. But, okay, with drug usage, we've got people like Dr. Timothy Leary, who was doing research, I think, for Harvard on LSD, and then he totally, gets into it. Yeah. So, there's experimentation with drug use and sex in the 60s amongst the counterculture. And Dr. Timothy Leary is telling everybody to turn on, tune in, and drop out, which basically he's dropping acid, all right? He's dropping acid. So, of course, psychedelics, the usage of psychedelics is going to be like all the rage in the 60s, and expand one's consciousness and spirituality and whatnot. So, of course, all of this dropping of acid and heavy drugs like that is definitely going to affect the lives of young people. I mean, come on now. So, as we get into the 70s, people are going to kind of get tired of this lifestyle. They're going to be not about the communal living anymore. They're going to want money now. And in the 70s, the hippies start to turn away from that. And as we get later into the 70s and early 80s, that's when they turn into yuppies, because that's where they're going to be all about money. So, all right, that's the counterculture. Let's go ahead and talk about the women's movement. So, we had talked a little bit about the book, The Feminine Mystique, when we had covered Eisenhower's presidency, because we were trying to counter the experience of housewives with this book, right? Because this book sheds light on the experience of housewives and how they were feeling boring. Their lives were boring. They were unhappy, and they weren't fulfilled. They just felt empty inside. And we're talking women who had earned like PhDs. We're talking women who had gone to law school, medical school. Hell, they had better grades than their husband, but yet they weren't practicing. Their husbands were. Because society deemed that as the appropriate thing to do, that women should stay home, take care of the kids and the household. So, Betty Friedan is going to encourage her readers to kind of fight against this, to not really live up to the male-dominated society and the gender roles that had been put in place, but to basically seek out new roles and responsibilities and find their own personal and professional identities and become their own women, pretty much. So the feminine mystique is leading women to a new direction, middle-class women mainly, in order to fulfill themselves by like obtaining their careers that they always wanted to do, and not let the home define them. So that's the importance of the feminine mystique, and Betty Friedan is the author of this book, and she's going to push for activism amongst women. So the big activist group that we see in the 60s is going to be called NOW, the National Organization of Women. So this is established in 66, and they're going to adopt a lot of the activist tactics that the civil rights movement had done, because a lot of these women were involved in the civil rights movement. They were the housewives driving around African Americans to their jobs and carpooling for them so that African Americans in Birmingham could, in Montgomery could do the bus boycott. So that's where they learn about activism, that's where they learn about organization, but even within those movements, women were marginalized and often pushed away for leadership roles. So they start to look within at their own rights, and they're like, you know what? Yeah, we need to fight for our own rights. And they're going to fight for things like equal treatment, job opportunities, equal pay. So Congress actually does implement some things, like the Equal Pay Act of 63 and the Civil Rights Act of 64, which includes Title IX, where you can't discriminate against women on the basis of gender. So, and other practices of discriminatory policy towards women is pretty much abolished around this time. Now, the purpose of NOW is to take action to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society now, exercising all the privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men. So we are going to see radical fringes of this movement. We're going to have even Marxist feminists. Yeah, that's a thing, guys. I had to do research on this, so yeah, that's a thing. But the feminist movement and the movement towards women's rights, we deem this as the second wave. Okay, the first wave was pushing for suffrage. All right, this is the second wave. We're pushing for more equality, like equal pay, equal work, and reproductive rights is another big thing on their mind, along with educational opportunities. And, just equality everywhere. So, where it comes to a head is the Equal Rights Amendment in 1973. This is what the women's movement is proposing to be added as an amendment to the Constitution. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So pretty much what they're saying is that, hey, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. That's it. Point blank, period. So, this amendment is proposed originally by Alice Paul in 1923. And we try to bring it up every session of Congress until it finally passed through in 1972. But here's the deal with amendments. Once they pass through Congress, then they go to the state legislatures. And the state legislatures need to approve it by a 3/4 margin. All right, so since we have 50 states, 38 states need to approve. So, really, it's going to try to help expand the 15th Amendment, 19th Amendment, 14th Amendment, basically all of them, all right? So, opponents to the amendment, like Phyllis Schlafly right here, look up her tweets, guys. She's been dead for a couple of years, but bruh, she's a piece of work. All right. You want to get triggered? Look up her quotes. So, opponents to the amendment, like Phyllis Schlafly, are going to claim that special protections under the law that women need, such as a waiver from conscription, is the reason why we shouldn't pass this amendment. All right, she's also claiming stuff like, oh, then we won't have separate dressing rooms, we won't have separate restrooms, blah, 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 blah. Bruh. I'm telling you, you want to get triggered? Read stuff that she has said. Okay, so she's going to be anti-Equal Rights Amendment. A person who's going to be pro-Equal Rights Amendment is going to be the likes of Gloria Steinem. So she's a journalist, and she's heavily involved in the women's rights movement going on here in the 60s. Now, Congress sets up a 7-year deadline for ratification. So 38 states need to approve this in 7 years. But it fell short by 3 states. And no, we cannot blame Texas. Texas actually voted for it. So, in essence, the Equal Rights Amendment never gets put into the Constitution. And part of this is because of conservative backlash. Conservatives by this point in time in the 70s were really, really freaking tired of all the rights movements, and they thought this was like another nuisance to them. So they vote overwhelmingly against it in these other states that did not approve. But there are advocates who continue to push to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, and even in recent years, I think we're only 1 state short now, if I'm not mistaken, or we may have actually reached the 38 states, because I think one of the states was Illinois, another state was Virginia, who recently approved it in the past 5 years, I want to say. Somebody look that up in the comments, and post it in the comments, because I think we actually did meet the 38 already, but it's a tricky freaking situation as far as rolling this in, because really time limits, anyways, conversation for another day. All right, let's talk about controversy here. Roe versus Wade. So, it's a very controversial case because it deals with abortion. And really what they're using in this case is the 9th Amendment's right to privacy. So, cases like Griswold versus Connecticut, who established that whole right to privacy over one's body, is going to be used to help decide this case, Roe versus Wade. So what this case actually sets up is a woman's right to an abortion. And they're saying that this right to an abortion is protected by the 9th Amendment. And, the right to privacy and stuff, and, rights reserved to the people. So this ruling gives women total autonomy over their bodies for the first 3 months of pregnancy. And, if you want one after that, like the 2nd trimester, it's got to be approved. 3rd trimester, totally illegal. So, of course, states have been effectively chipping away at this, even in recent years. And, I think there's even a case on the docket now, trying to look at abortion rights. So, yeah, buddy. This is a controversial topic all around, but so far, Roe versus Wade still stands. I don't know about the future. We do have a very conservative court right now. But, hey, cases get overturned, and then there's new cases that bring it back sometimes. So, I don't know. Don't know what the future's going to hold on this. All right, one last thing about the women's movement. We got divorce rates climbing because women aren't putting up with crap anymore. There were high rates of abuse amongst marriages in the 50s, and women just kind of took it because you didn't want to stand out. It's a conformist society. You stand out and get divorced. Communist, right? Or they'd label you something else. So, women just aren't staying in these marriages anymore. Divorce rates are on the rise. And societal acceptance of divorce is changing, right? So even without the Equal Rights Amendment passing, the women's movement did accomplish various things, like hiring practices. More women are moving into professions like business, law, medicine, and politics. But there is still a glass ceiling here in society, and women still do not make on par what men do for similar jobs. I think it's 75 cents to $1 every man makes, so not perfect, guys, but more rights were obtained. All right, let's move on to our next movement. We got the Chicano Movement. So, Chicanos are going to fight for their rights as well. And they look at the civil rights movement for inspiration. And they look at how they too are discriminated in public and private institutions. So in the early 20th century, we've got groups like MALDEF, we have La Raza Unida, and LULAC being formed in the 20s. So the Chicano movement in the early 70s really gets kickstarted, and we're going to look at people like Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta. Even during World War II, prior to that, I mean, Dr. Hector P. Garcia is establishing the American GI Forum, which is going to help address the shortcomings taking place against Mexican-American veterans and help to end the discrimination of that, where the GI Bill was like kind of not being really extended or held back in some ways. But anyways, it's an activist organization established in Corpus Christi. So, Mexican-American civil rights activists are going to achieve several legal victories as well, like Mendes versus Westminster, which makes it illegal to segregate children of Mexican descent, and Hernandez versus Texas, where Mexican-Americans are entitled to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. So, yeah, this sort of stuff needs to be established by the courts. But arguably the most well-known person in the Chicano movement is Cesar Chavez. So here he is marching. He's basically the equivalent of Martin Luther King Jr. for migrant workers. Now, there he is breaking bread and breaking a fast that he was doing with Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy, had he become president, would have worked with Cesar Chavez to extend rights to Hispanics. But yeah, that didn't happen. We'll learn more later at the end of the lecture. Okay, Cesar Chavez is going to fight for the equal and fair treatment of migrant workers. He's going to use boycotts, like boycotting California grapes, demonstrations, marches, and whatnot. And his partner in crime here, Dolores Huerta. They're going to gain a lot of rights for migrant farm workers with their group, the United Farm Workers, the UFW, and try to get better working conditions for them, better pay, better hours, and just more rights, right? So, yeah, some of the stuff that they had to endure, like no access to clean drinking water or portable toilets, housing was inadequate. I mean, their wages were terrible, plus their working conditions. So yeah, all of this is being fought against, and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta are successful with gaining these rights. So with Native Americans, dude, I'm telling you, we got a lot of rights movements right now. Native Americans push for their rights as well. So in 1961, up until 61, the federal government had tried to get Native Americans to move off their reservations and into cities to encourage assimilation. But in 61, this continued, and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights noted that Native Americans' poverty and deprivation are common because, yeah, the reservations were in a poor state of affairs. So they, too, look at the civil rights movement for inspiration, and Native Americans start trying to seek better life and autonomy. So they're going to get a series of court victories that helps them win their property back that was illegally taken from them in previous decades. So the group that is at the forefront of this is the American Indian Movement called AIM. And they're going to be sort of standoffish against federal forces. We are going to see a standoff at Wounded Knee and in Alcatraz. So Americans become aware of the plight of Native Americans as a result of these actions, these speeches, these standoffs, well, marches, standoffs, and whatnot. So let's go ahead and learn about the two of them. The big ones, Alcatraz Island and Wounded Knee. So you guys know Alcatraz is like a famous prison, right? It was like unescapable until people escaped. So then it got shut down. But anyways, it's like a national park now or something. So in 1970, a group of militant, members of the American Indian movement are going to demand that Alcatraz Island be turned into a cultural center and an Indian university. So they're going to occupy Alcatraz for a year and a half until federal marshals, FBI agents, special forces are able to remove the group that's there. So as a result of the occupation, the government policy of self-determination of tribes was ended, and the government policy of termination of Indian tribes is ended, and the policy of self-determination becomes the standard now. So, all right. While they were occupying Alcatraz, Nixon returns Blue Lake and land to the Taos Indians, and lands near Davis University is going to turn into that Native American university that they wanted. So, okay, that's Alcatraz. All right, let's go ahead and talk about Wounded Knee. So this happens in 1973. AIM is part of this one. And at Wounded Knee, there's an occupation that lasts 71 days there. But there's a shootout with the federal agents, and 2 Sioux men were killed. So May 8th, AIM leaders are going to surrender after White House officials prompted to investigate their complaints. So, yeah. But things end up turning out a little better for them. Okay, another movement. We got the gay liberation movement. So, I'm telling you guys, there's a lot of movements. Okay, now, in 1969, police are going to raid the Stonewall Inn, which is a gay bar in New York City. It's going to cause a riot, and this kind of is like the spark for the gay rights movement. So gay rights activists are going to urge people to open up about their identities and to work to end discrimination and violent abuses against, the LGBTQ community. So by the mid-70s, homosexuality is no longer classified as a mental illness, and federal civil service dropped its ban on employment of homosexuals. So a big figure in this movement is going to be Harvey Milk right there. He's there in the middle. He ends up getting elected to, I think, city council in San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken, but he is assassinated. Further going on with the gay liberation movement and gay rights, in 1993, President Clinton tries to attempt to end the discrimination against gays and lesbians in the military. But he has to compromise instead with the policy of don't ask, don't tell. And essentially what this policy does is people wouldn't be asked about their sexuality, and they don't tell about it. But if the military found out that you're gay or lesbian or whatever, they could kick you out. I think since then the policy has been overturned, but that's what we got. All right. Whew. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. I think I'm going to save Vietnam for later, guys, because, there's still a lot of stuff to cover. So let's do Space Race, and then we'll call it a day. Okay. So, President Johnson is heavily involved with NASA. I mean, it's our goal to get men to the moon by 1969. And so throughout this presidency, NASA is going to be working on achieving that goal. There are several Apollo missions that take place. Apollo 1 ends up in disaster. The astronauts in there get burned alive. So subsequent missions are going to prove well, not deadly, but I mean, they're not able to land on the moon until Apollo 11. So, Apollo 11 happens July 16th, 1969, and these are the 3 astronauts involved in the Apollo mission here. We've got Neil Armstrong, who's in the center. We've got Michael Collins, who's the pilot. He never steps foot on the moon because he's, piloting the spacecraft here. And then we've got Buzz Aldrin. So, he pilots the lunar module, but the greater spacecraft is going to get them back home, Michael Collins. All right. Now, you guys have seen the pictures and like the video and stuff, okay? Famous quote, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," by Neil Armstrong. He's the first one that steps foot on the moon. And there's one of the pictures of the footprint on the lunar soil. Because there's a bunch of dust and stuff like on the moon, so that's why it looks kind of like that. Now, millions of people are going to watch this being televised in black and white because, yeah, long range. I mean, come on now. But anyways, so soon after Armstrong steps on the lunar surface, Buzz Aldrin's going to follow, and you're going to see them like hopping around and stuff. Yeah, if you guys didn't know this, space is kind of pitch black. You don't really see stars in space because the sun is the big freaking star that is illuminating the landscape here. All right. I know there's conspiracy theories that point at like the flag, like, oh, look, it's waving, this didn't take place on the moon because of that. Dude, it's got wires in it. Okay. The moon doesn't have wind. So do we really want the American flag drooping all over looking all sad? No, we don't. So the reason why it's so wrinkly is because we've got wires trying to hold it up. All right? Wires within the flag. And come on, they rolled it up. It's going to look wrinkly. So yeah, that's, dude, I just can't with conspiracy theories. I just can't, man. But anyways, so going back to landing on the moon here. Yeah, do you guys know there's a plaque on the moon that says, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." And it's signed by the 3 astronauts and President Richard Nixon. Dude, I swear, if aliens are like on the moon, they're going to be like, oh, the leader of Earth is Richard Nixon? Oh, okay. Dude, we could have done much better than that. Oh, why didn't this happen under LBJ? Anyways, that's neither here nor there. So let's go ahead and talk some more about the lunar landing. And, yeah. So, 2 astronauts are going to, set up the flag and stuff, get some moon rocks, all that, and then be on their way. There's going to be subsequent missions to the moon that do lunar landings. Apollo 13 is going to be a disaster, though. They try the lunar landing and everything goes wrong. So, really, the success of the Apollo 13 mission was getting the astronauts home back alive. But anyways, there's subsequent missions, the Apollo missions, and then they kind of stop because people stopped looking at like landing on the moon as like a big deal. So yeah, but there we go, guys. That is our talk on the various rights movements and NASA and the Supreme Court. Bro, there was a lot of information. And we can't fit Vietnam in this. There's no way I can cover Vietnam in like 5 minutes. So yeah, I'm going to hold off Vietnam for next time. And the rest of the 60s, which includes stuff like war protesting, right? We've all seen this. So, and the 68 election, which is a pivotal election at that time. So it's looking like next time's going to be Vietnam, 68 election, and Richard Nixon. So, whew. Okay, I will talk to you guys later. All right, bye guys.